In the early hours of November 15, 1959, two men quietly slipped into the Clutter home through an unlocked door, searching for a safe. When they found nothing, they woke Herb Clutter, the father, who sleepily handed over the little cash he had, claiming there was no more to find. The intruders then disturbed the rest of the family. Bonnie, Herb's wife, was tied up and gagged before being tucked into a bed upstairs. Their 16-year-old daughter, Nancy, also had her hands bound, but was left ungagged. Herb and his 15-year-old son, Kenyon, were dragged to the basement, where Kenyon was bound and gagged on a sofa. Herb was left helpless on a mattress on the floor. While one man continued to search upstairs for valuables, he found nothing and grew furious. He stormed back to the basement, convinced that Herb was hiding something. After a heated argument, he brutally slit Herb's throat and shot him in cold blood. They then turned on Kenyon, Nancy, and Bonnie, killing them one by one without a second thought. These killers even drove over 400 miles to carry out their twisted plan. But why? Did they know this family at all? This is the chilling case of the Clutter family murders, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why it remains one of the most infamous murder cases in history, the very case that started the true crime genre itself. For those who didn't know, the Clutter family murders are seen as the birth of the true crime genre, thanks to the famous book In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Published in 1966, the book tells the shocking story of the 1959 murders that we are going to talk about today. Capote was so fascinated by the crime that he decided to travel to Kansas to learn more. And he didn't go alone. He brought his childhood friend Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird. Together, they interviewed people, gathered details, and worked on the book for 6 years. When In Cold Blood finally came out, it was a huge success and is still one of the best-selling true crime books to this day, second only to Helter Skelter, which tells the story of the Manson family murders. Now, let's look at the heart of the story. Herbert William Clutter, born on May 24, 1911, was a respected and well-known figure in Holcomb, Kansas. He graduated from Kansas State University and was active in the First United Methodist Church. Holcomb was a tiny town with only 272 people by the 1970 census. Everyone knew each other, doors were rarely locked, and the town had a small dirt main street. Herbert Clutter was a successful farmer, owning River Valley Farm, which stretched over more than 620 acres. His hard work earned him a great reputation in the agricultural world, and he was quite wealthy. The Clutters lived in a beautiful 14-room house built in 1948 for $40,000, which was a lot of money at the time. So, with all that being said, Herbert Clutter was a wealthy man, but he never flaunted his money. He was married to Bonnie Clutter, and together they had 4 children, Eviana, Beverly, Nancy, and Kenyon. By 1959, the 2 older girls had moved out, leaving Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon in the family home. In the book, Truman Capote delves into Bonnie's mental health struggles. After the birth of her 4 children, she battled postnatal depression, which continued to affect her throughout her life. Capote also mentioned her physical ailments, including a displaced vertebra in her spine. Doctors had suggested that an operation could relieve both her mental and physical issues. However, surviving family members argued that this portrayal doesn't do justice to Bonnie. She wasn't just a sick person. She adored being outdoors and loved hosting gatherings at their home. Described as a true lady, she was eagerly anticipating a big family Thanksgiving, with relatives traveling from all over the country to celebrate. On the other hand, Nancy Clutter, born on January 2, 1943, was 16 years old at the time of her death. Like the rest of her family, she was well-liked and respected in Holcomb, where she had a wide circle of friends. Nancy attended church every week, enjoyed baking, and loved horseback riding. Her boyfriend, Bobby, remarked that she didn't have a mean bone in her body. Then there was Kenyon, who was a year and a half younger than Nancy, born on August 29, 1944. At just 15, Kenyon was full of energy, always on the move and ready to crack a joke. He was just beginning to step into adulthood when his life was tragically cut short. On the 15th of November 1959, a sense of dread hung in the air. It was a Sunday, and two of Nancy's friends came over, as they did every week, to go to church together. This time, however, they knocked on the door but received no answer. The cars were still in the garage, and everything seemed perfectly normal, yet there was an unsettling silence inside the house. After several attempts to call the home, they decided to check again. This time, they found the front door unlocked and stepped inside, calling for Nancy. The house was eerily quiet. Worried, they headed to Nancy's room, expecting to find her still asleep. Instead, they were met with a horrific sight. Nancy lay dead in her bed, blood splattered across the walls.
Clutters did not lock their doors at night. They trusted their neighbors. They didn't expect evil to come to their door.
What happened then?
The father of one of Nancy's friends was waiting outside the house and decided to go in to call the police himself. Once inside, he noticed the phone receiver was off the hook and the phone lines had been cut. Realizing something was very wrong, he and his son drove to a nearby place to call the police and alert them about the situation at the Clutter home. When the police arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. Herbert Clutter was found in the basement's furnace room, bound and gagged, with a shotgun wound to the front of his head and his throat slit. Kenyon, his son, was found in another basement room, also bound and gagged and shot in the same manner. Bonnie Clutter was discovered in her bedroom, similarly bound and shot in the side of her head. Nancy lay dead in her bed, bound but shot in the back of her head. The police noted that Nancy was the only victim shot from behind, suggesting she might not have seen her killer. Was it someone she knew? Someone who couldn't bear the thought of her looking at them as they took her life? The entire community was left in shock. The Clutter family was well respected and liked by everyone. No one had anything bad to say about them. It was puzzling why such a tragedy had occurred, as they had no enemies or conflicts. The small-town residents wondered if the murderer was someone they knew, perhaps even a friend or acquaintance. Fear spread like wildfire. Hardware stores quickly ran out of locks as people started locking their doors for the first time in their lives.
We didn't know who did it or why. Everybody was on edge.
It truly made a different community. There was fear for the first time.
By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Going back, the police started their investigation as they meticulously photographed every room in the house and every victim, searching for fingerprints. They found a single footprint near Nancy's blood. It belonged to a pair of worn-out cat boots. Despite their thorough examination, the only items missing were a small portable radio and a pair of binoculars. It was strange. Those items didn't seem like a motive for such brutal murders. However, there was a possible motive. The day before the murders, Herbert had taken out a life insurance policy for $40,000, which would go directly to his two surviving daughters after his death. Were his daughters somehow involved in the tragic fate of their family? Upon closer investigation, the police discovered that the new life insurance policy wasn't the motive for the murders. It was just a terrible coincidence. Herbert had been working on this policy for many months, but he only signed it the very afternoon of the tragic event. The officers quickly realized that his surviving daughters couldn't possibly be involved. They were completely heartbroken. So, to begin their inquiry, the police decided to talk to Nancy's boyfriend, Bobby Rupp. They stressed that he wasn't a suspect. They just wanted to ask him some questions. Bobby had spent the night at the Clutter home, leaving shortly after 10 p.m. He and Nancy had planned to go to a midnight movie on Saturday, but Herbert suggested they go to the Friday night showing instead. If they hadn't changed their plans, it's likely that Nancy would still be alive. Now, according to the family's relatives, Herbert had always been wary of Nancy's relationship with Bobby. While he thought Bobby was a nice and respectful young man, He felt Nancy was too young at just 16 to be so serious. She had been dating Bobby for 3 years, and Herbert believed she shouldn't put all her eggs in one basket, especially since their families had different beliefs. Nancy's family were Methodists, while Bobby's were Roman Catholics. Herbert even asked Nancy to take a step back from the relationship, but Bobby continued to visit. So, on that night, Bobby had left the house just hours before the tragic events unfolded, making him the last person to see the Clutter family alive. It was natural for the police to dig deeper into his background. After interviewing him and giving him a polygraph test, they confirmed that Bobby had nothing to do with the murders. He was just a 17-year-old boy deeply in love with Nancy. He was not capable of such violence. However, because he was the last person seen with the family, the community became suspicious of him, unfairly branding him as guilty. The pressure became so intense that Bobby had to switch high schools and move to another town to escape the judgment. The police also considered the idea that Herbert's business rivals might have been involved, but every lead they pursued turned out to be a dead end. It was baffling, a whole family murdered and no clear motive. The police began to suspect that this might have been a random act of violence by someone looking to cause chaos. In response, the local newspaper offered a $1,000 reward for any information that could help catch the killers. Unfortunately, this just brought in a flood of useless tips. 250 leads came in, but all were dead ends. On the Wednesday after the tragic murders, the funeral for the Clutter family was held. Family members traveled from all over the country to pay their respects. Just imagine being one of the 2 oldest daughters at that funeral, facing the heartbreaking loss of your entire family. It's hard to fathom how painful that must have been. Amid this darkness, there was a small ray of hope. Beverly, the second daughter, was engaged to be married that December. Since the police had no idea why the murders happened, they advised Beverly to change her name now, rather than wait until her wedding. They didn't want the killer to potentially track her down if the motive was connected to the Clutter family. With her family gathered for the funeral, Beverly thought, "Why not get married now? I'll have to change my name anyway." So she went ahead with her wedding, which was attended by family, friends, church members, and the whole community. It was described as a fairy tale wedding happening in the midst of such a nightmare. As time passed, the investigation started to go cold. There were no leads, no clues, and not even the usual small-town gossip you might expect in cases like this. The police had piles of photographs from the crime scene, but progress was slow. However, in one of those photographs, they discovered a crucial piece of evidence. They found a footprint in blood in the basement near Herbert's body. But upon closer inspection of the photographs, they noticed another footprint in the dust. One that wasn't visible to the naked eye but showed up in the camera's light. This second print belonged to a different boot, suggesting that they were looking for 2 suspects instead of just one.
Boot marks in the blood.
We were able to see a boot print that one could not observe with the naked eye.
They knew that there was a potential of a second suspect.
While this didn't necessarily help the investigation further, since they still didn't know where to start, it at least provided some clarity. They now knew they were searching for 2 individuals. Then, just when it seemed like the case would remain unsolved, luck struck. 10 days after the murders, the police received a tip that someone had valuable information. That $1,000 reward from the local newspaper had caught the attention of an inmate at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas. An FBI detective was sent to interview him. This inmate was 32-year-old Floyd Wells, who had worked for the Clutters 10 years earlier in 1948 and 1949. Floyd Wells had a colorful life, trying his hand at many different jobs, but never really settling into one. He served as a soldier, worked as a ranch hand, and even took on mechanic roles. When he was just 19, he started working for the Clutter family on their farm, right as they were finishing up their beautiful new house. Floyd loved his time with the Clutters. They treated him like family. He recalled how Mr. Clutter surprised him with an extra $50 as a Christmas bonus, showing just how kind they were. After finishing his work with the Clutters in 1949, Floyd went through a series of ups and downs. He got married, then divorced, and even served in the Army. Fast forward 10 years to June 1959, and Floyd found himself in trouble. He was arrested for breaking into an electrical appliance store in an attempt to steal a lawnmower. He had dreams of starting a lawnmower rental business, but figured he needed the equipment first. Unfortunately, he got caught and ended up with a 5-year prison sentence. While in prison, Floyd's cellmate was a man named Richard Hickok, who he called Dick. Since they spent a lot of time together, they had plenty of conversations. One day, their talk shifted to past jobs, and Floyd shared stories about working for Mr. Clutter on his farm in western Kansas. Curious, Hickok asked Floyd if Mr. Clutter was wealthy. Floyd nodded and explained how he once saw Mr. Clutter pay a hefty lumber bill in cash from a safe inside his home. That week alone, he remembered Mr. Clutter spending around $10,000 on various bills. From then on, Hickok couldn't stop asking questions about the Clutter family. He wanted to know how many of them there were, their ages, and the layout of the house. He even inquired about where Mr. Clutter kept his safe. Floyd shared everything he knew, not realizing how dangerous this information would become. Before long, Hickok started talking about a sinister plan he had to kill Mr. Clutter, going into detail about how he intended to carry it out. Hickok often mentioned a man named Perry Edward Smith, whom he had met while they were both in prison in Lansing. Although Smith had been released on parole, Hickok knew he could always count on him as a partner. The two men had a close bond, and some sources even speculate that they may have had a romantic relationship, but that remains uncertain after all these years. Hickok seemed to have a special attachment to Perry, and was eager to get him involved in his plan to target the Clutter family. Hickok vividly described to Floyd how he intended to carry out this crime, detailing plans to tie up the Clutters and shoot them. However, Floyd didn't take Hickok seriously. Life in prison often involved this kind of bravado, talking tough to intimidate other inmates or just to boast. So, Floyd shrugged off Hickok's threats as mere prison chatter. That all changed one day while lying in his cell, listening to the news on the radio. He heard about the tragic murders of the Clutter family in western Kansas. Even then, Floyd remained silent. The fear of being labeled a snitch in prison was far too great. It could cost him his life. Despite this, he followed the news closely, especially when they announced a reward of $1,000 for information about the murders. The reward almost tempted him to speak up, but he hesitated. Along with the fear of being a snitch, he worried about being seen as an accomplice to murder. After all, he had unknowingly led the killers to the Clutters. Eventually, Floyd couldn't hold it in any longer. He confided in a fellow inmate who was religious and whom he trusted. This inmate offered to help Floyd get called into the warden's office without it looking suspicious. It would seem like Floyd was in trouble for something else, not for snitching. The next day, he was summoned to the warden's office, and he finally told his story. 10 days later, the police had the answers they needed. They confirmed that Floyd Wells had indeed worked for the Clutter family 10 years earlier and gathered information about Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, complete with mugshots. Now they knew who they were searching for, but they still had no idea where to find them. Now, to give you some context, Richard Eugene Dick Hickok was born in Kansas City to farm worker parents. As the firstborn son, he was a star athlete, excelling in baseball, basketball, and football. He had a happy childhood, got good grades, and graduated high school with plans to study engineering in college. Unfortunately, his family couldn't afford to send him, so he took a job with the Santa Fe Railway in Kansas City. At just 19, he married a 16-year-old named Carol. Together, they rented a house and bought a nice car, starting their life as a young couple. After his time working in various jobs, Dick started driving ambulances for the local hospital. He then transitioned to working as a mechanic and a car painter, showing promise for a bright future. However, Everything changed one fateful day when he was involved in a serious car accident. His vehicle flipped over, crashing into the water by the side of the road, leaving him face down and unconscious. Thankfully, a passerby noticed and rushed to pull him out just before he drowned. The accident left Dick with a severe head injury that would alter his life forever. His face became slightly disfigured, and his features became noticeably asymmetrical. His father noted that Dick was never the same after the accident. His personality shifted dramatically. He started engaging in petty crimes, gambling, writing bad checks, and even cheating on his wife, Carol, with an older mistress. Eventually, he left Carol for this mistress, despite having 3 children with her. As his criminal activities escalated, Dick began stealing firearms and attempting to sell them. His actions ultimately caught up with him, leading to his incarceration at Lansing Penitentiary, where he met Floyd Wells. On the other hand, Perry Edward Smith had a troubled upbringing. Born in Huntington, Nevada, to rodeo-performing parents Tex and Flo, he had a mixed heritage. His father was Irish, and his mother was Cherokee Native American. Unlike Hickok, Perry's childhood was tumultuous. In 1929, his family moved to Alaska, where Tex began distilling bootleg whiskey for a living. Unfortunately, he was abusive towards his wife and children, causing Flo to leave with the kids to San Francisco. However, she struggled with alcoholism, and life didn't improve much for them there. Perry felt the impact of this unstable childhood deeply. At just 8 years old, he was arrested for the first time, marking the beginning of a troubled life. Tragically, Flo died in an alcoholic coma when Perry was 13, choking on her own vomit. This event led to Perry and his siblings being shuffled between various orphanages and institutions, where they faced physical and emotional abuse. Eventually, Perry reunited with his father, and they attempted to live together while moving around the western United States. Unfortunately, their relationship was rocky, and Perry, who was struggling himself, turned to petty crime to survive. Without an education, he found it difficult to make a stable life for himself. Perry joined the Army and served in the Korean War. In 1952, he received an honorable discharge, despite spending time in the stockade for fighting. While stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington, he bought a motorcycle with his first paycheck, but was soon involved in a serious accident that left him hospitalized for 6 months. As a result, he suffered permanent leg disabilities and chronic pain, requiring him to rely on medication for the rest of his life. By 1956, Perry was convicted of grand larceny, jailbreak, and car theft, leading to his imprisonment at Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, where he formed a close bond with Dick Hickok. Perry was released from prison early in 1959, and shortly after, Hickok also gained his freedom in November of that same year. Right after being released from prison, Hickok wasted no time. He quickly reached out to Perry Smith, urging him to break his parole and return to Kansas to help with a robbery he had been plotting. In jail, Smith had claimed he had killed a man, a story that many found hard to believe, but it gained traction among inmates, including Hickok, who trusted Smith completely. Hickok was convinced that Smith would assist him in committing these crimes, referring to this heist as his big score, and he believed Smith wouldn't hesitate to kill if necessary. Earlier that year, Smith had been paroled and briefly lived with his father in Reno. However, after a fallout, he found himself on the move and spent a month in Las Vegas. When he received Hickok's letter, he decided to return to Kansas City, hoping to reunite with another former inmate. Unfortunately, he missed the meeting by just a few hours. Once they reunited, Hickok laid out his robbery plan, and they got straight to work. On the night of November 14th, they entered the Clutter family home through an unlocked door. Their intention was to kill the family and steal cash from a safe. However, they were shocked to discover there was no safe at all, meaning they had killed the Clutter family for no reason whatsoever. After the murders, the pair headed to Kansas City, where Hickok briefly worked at a car paint shop. He stopped going to work after the 20th, and on the 21st, he tried to pass a bad check for $192 at the Elko Camera Shop. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation later spoke with Hickok's parents, who mentioned that Dick and Perry had taken a trip to Fort Scott, Kansas, on November 14th, allegedly to find one of Perry's sisters. They returned home for a quick lunch on November 15th before heading to Kansas City. The KBI conducted a search of their home and found a bloody shirt in a drawer and a shotgun that Hickok had bought. While owning a shotgun was quite common in Kansas and didn't raise immediate red flags, the KBI believed they were on the right trail. After spending a short time in Kansas City and writing several bad checks, the duo decided to escape to Mexico. They reportedly pawned the radio and binoculars they had stolen from the Clutters and even sold the car they had used to drive there. However, they eventually planned to return to the United States, intending to commit more crimes to earn enough money to escape to Brazil, where they thought they couldn't be extradited back to the U.S. They crossed back into the States 31 days after the murders, mailing most of their belongings to Las Vegas for later pickup. This was part of their strategy to travel light so they could easily hitchhike across the country. After hitchhiking east and stealing a car in Iowa, Hickok and Perry Smith found themselves back in Kansas City. Hickok began passing a staggering number of bad checks, totaling over $500. On December 16th, authorities received a tip from a furniture store about bad checks being used to purchase a television set. The KBI raced to the scene, where employees identified Hickok from a photo. At the same time, a service station worker recognized him as he tried to use a bad check there, putting the authorities hot on their trail. From Kansas City, the pair drove down to Miami, Florida, where they spent Christmas. They sold everything they had bought with those bad checks in Miami and continued their zigzag journey across the United States, picking up odd jobs here and there for cash. Around New Year's, they decided to return to Las Vegas, still driving the stolen car from Iowa. However, by the time they reached Vegas and picked up their belongings from the post office, the police had started to catch on to the car's dubious history. Finally, the police stopped them. When they searched the trunk of the car, they discovered 2 pairs of boots, one with a cat's paw sole and the other with diamond tread, matching the boot prints found at the Clutter murder scene. This crucial piece of evidence linked them directly to the murders. If the police had apprehended them just an hour earlier, they would have missed finding those boots, and this vital evidence could have slipped away. It was pure luck for law enforcement. The Kansas police traveled to Las Vegas to interview Hickok and Smith, focusing on Hickok, who was known to be more talkative. Smith, on the other hand, seemed detached and cold. Hickok was charming and chatty, so the police started by discussing the bad checks found in the Kansas City area before directly asking about the Clutter family murders. They informed Hickok that they had irrefutable evidence placing both men at the crime scene, making it impossible for them to deny involvement. Under pressure, Hickok began to talk. He asked if there was any way he could get out on a manslaughter charge, claiming, "I never pulled the trigger. In fact, I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was in the other room when it first happened."
What happened then? I heard a commotion in where Mr. Clutter was. I don't know how to describe it more. It's like a gurgling noise. That's when I seen it. It cut his throat. What did he use to cut up my dick? That's a knife. But he cut the hell out of it.
He shifted the blame for the murders onto Perry Smith, who remained silent and avoided the questions, denying any knowledge of the Clutter family murders while Hickok effectively confessed in the other room. Eventually, the 2 men were driven back to Kansas in separate cars, with Dick Hickok in the front vehicle and Perry Smith in the one behind. This arrangement was deliberate. Investigators knew Hickok couldn't stop talking. They figured if Smith saw Hickok chatting away with the investigators, he would likely get frustrated. And that's precisely what happened. As Smith simmered with anger, he began talking to the investigator in his car. He pointed out that they had agreed to stay silent if they were ever caught, but here was Hickok spilling his version of the story. Smith shared how he had received a letter from Dick, detailing their plan to stay at Dick's parents' house to put new tires on the car before heading to Holcomb the next morning. They had Dick's shotgun and a hunting jacket stuffed with shells, along with more ammunition in the trunk. During their trip, they stopped to buy cord, knowing they would need to tie up people. They bought all the cord available, enough to restrain about 12 to 14 individuals. They arrived at the Clutter home between midnight and 1 a.m. While scouting the area, they encountered Mr. Clutter and asked him where the safe was. Mr. Clutter insisted there was no safe and that he kept no money in the house. However, Dick was convinced Mr. Clutter was lying, although Smith believed him. Instructed by Hickok, Smith cut the phone lines and they went upstairs, waking up Bonnie first. She echoed her husband's earlier claim that there was no safe. They then woke Kenyon before finally getting to Nancy, who was already awake. In his account, Smith expressed his disgust at Hickok's attitude. He was shocked by how Hickok was behaving, having never seen him like that before. Smith believed the family when they insisted there was no safe, while Hickok refused to accept it. The two decided to separate the family members, tying them up one by one in different rooms of the house. Even after finding about $50 in change, they continued to press Mr. Clutter for money. He assured them that if he had any cash, he would have given it to them by now. Frustrated, Smith turned to Hickok and asked, "What now?" Hickok coldly replied that they were to leave no witnesses behind. The two debated who would go first. Eventually, fueled by anger and frustration, Dick stabbed Mr. Clutter in the throat with his hunting knife. He then urged Hickok to do his part, and Hickok stabbed Mr. Clutter again in the same wound. Smith shot Mr. Clutter in the head, then turned the gun on Kenyon, and finally shot Nancy and Bonnie. While Hickok was right about Smith being capable of murder, there's considerable debate about the exact sequence of events. Both men had conflicting accounts regarding who killed the two women. Hickok testified that Smith murdered all 4 family members, while Smith initially confessed to killing the women, but later refused to sign his confession, stating he had shot them. Both men declined to testify in court, leading to a lack of official documentation on who was responsible for the murders. Their only defense during the trial centered around the claim of insanity. A psychiatrist was called in to assess both men. Hickok was found to be impulsive, possibly due to a prior head injury, and exhibited a notable lack of empathy. Surprisingly, he expressed some remorse, not for the murders themselves, but for getting caught. He even mentioned that he would be upset if someone harmed his own family. Hickok's troubling attraction to teenage girls is another aspect of his character. His first wife was only 16 when he was 19, and this pattern persisted as he got older. He later admitted that one of his main motives for targeting the Clutter home was not just robbery, but the desire to assault 16-year-old Nancy Clutter. Even when he realized there was no safe to steal from, he was still intent on committing his crime until Smith stepped in to stop him. For Smith, the thought of rape was a line he couldn't cross, even in the context of their violent plan. On the flip side, Perry Smith was genuinely curious about his own psyche and wanted to understand what made him tick. He acknowledged that there was something wrong with him for committing such terrible acts. The psychiatrist described him as paranoid and borderline delusional, reflecting a troubled mind. Smith had a difficult childhood that contributed to severe anger issues. Interestingly, when they arrived at the Clutter house, he initially wanted to turn back but ultimately lost control and ended up committing murder. The key question during their trial was whether they could distinguish right from wrong. The psychiatrist concluded that Hickok understood the difference, while he couldn't form a definitive opinion about Smith's mental state. Both men were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. On March 29, 1960, they were found guilty, and the jury recommended the death penalty. After spending 5 years on death row at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, They were executed by hanging on April 14, 1965. Hickok was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m., followed by Smith at 1:19 a.m. The tragic murders of the Clutter family, carried out for a mere $50 worth of items, continue to leave a haunting impression on society. In a twist of fate, years later, both Hickok and Smith's bodies were exhumed from the cemetery as authorities aimed to solve a cold case that had lingered for 53 years. This involved the tragic murders of the Walker family, Cliff and Christine Walker, along with their two young children, 3-year-old Jimmy and 1-year-old Debbie. The entire family was shot to death in their home in Osprey, Florida, on December 19, 1959.
The KBI exhumed the bodies of Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. The two men were executed for the murders of Herb and Bonnie Clutter and their children in Holcomb, Kansas.
At the time of the Walker murders, Hickok and Smith were known to be in Florida, spending Christmas not far from where this crime occurred. They were initially considered suspects, but a polygraph test cleared them of the murders. However, with modern standards for polygraph testing, those results would not hold up today. Authorities hoped that by exhuming the bodies, they could match DNA samples to semen found on Christine Walker, who had been raped by her murderer. By August 2014, it was announced that investigators had been unable to find a DNA match. Only partial DNA could be retrieved from the bones, and the samples taken from Christine were too old, degraded, and contaminated. Thus, Hickok and Smith remain at the forefront of suspicion in the Walker family case, even if they cannot be definitively ruled in or out. If you're interested, just let me know, and I can provide a complete overview of the Walker family tragedy. In the meantime, what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe that the death penalty is a relatively minor punishment for these two murderers? Please share your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoy our videos and want to help us bring more cases like this to light, please hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth explorations. Thank you once again for watching.